Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of JewishDrinking.com, the show, podcast, video. And today we have on a special guest, Eli Gurevich, who is known for creating Toseftaonline.org. And today we're going to be discussing a particular text within the Tosefta and Tosefta Berakhot. And I'm really excited because for years I've been seeing Toseftaonline.org and really impressed, excited that it's been around. And one of the products that Eli put out was a translation of the entirety of Tosefta Berakhot. And it's very fitting that we're discussing a text within Tosefta Berakhot. And by the way, people can buy that book, right, on Lulu?
Yeah, they can buy it on Lulu, or there's a link on my website. They can also buy it through Amazon.
Awesome. And I got to ask, how did you decide to start up Tosefta Online?
At my job, I have a sabbatical once every few years. And my sabbatical gives me vacation for like 2 months. And I thought, well, what should I do during my 2 months? And I decided, why don't I write a book? And I always wanted to write a book on a subject was kind of obscure.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And as you know, the Tosefta is not much learned in the Jewish circles.
Yeah.
So I decided to do it.
All right, cool. And how much have you continued with it over the years?
So I did 2 Masechtas. I did Berachot and I did Peah. But when I did most of Peah, I never really finished Peah. Then I did a bunch of separate Toseftas for different people who asked questions. And then I kind of abandoned it, moved on to other things. So hopefully I'll get another sabbatical and then I'll get back into it.
And there's a bunch of other resources on the website. It's not just the translations or your books, right?
Right. You can download all the available manuscripts of the Tosefta, and you can download all the commentaries that are not in copyright, which is pretty much probably 99% of them.
Before we continue on, Eli, what are you drinking tonight?
Angry Orchard Hard Cider Rosé.
Awesome. Very, very cool. And I've got also a very a non-gluten drink as well, which is super random. It's gold rum mixed with grenadine and peach liqueur. So
cool.
So a similarly gluten-free drink as yourself. So how much have you been tending to Toseftaonline.org over the years? How much do you want to continue building with it? Because you've got other projects also out there.
Yeah, right? I have a bunch of other projects. But Tosefta, it was kind of my baby. I started, nobody was doing it before. It's a very intense work. So, I hope to get back to it one day, but right now there are just other priorities.
Yeah, I understand. But I'm glad that it still exists, that it's still out there. It's a resource for the entire world, for whomever wants to get it, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Can I just ask you, I'm curious, what responses, what attention your Berakhot translation is like? Have you received much attention for it?
No, not that much. I mean, if you Google how many people actually Google the word Tosefta,
yeah,
you're not going to get a lot. It's very, very few. The response from the Orthodox community was really almost next to nothing.
Oh, wow.
There was actually more response from people who are getting PhDs on rabbinic literature subjects. So there was more response like that. And I've gotten questions over the years and people asking things, usually researchers, but not so much from people who just learn stuff day to day.
Right. Yeah, the Tosefta tends to be more the province of academia than it is necessarily
right.
Yeah. It's just the way the world works.
The way it played out.
But still a traditional rabbinic text, so it's there.
That's right.
All right, so we're gonna hop into it. So I was really curious. This is a text that involves a really fascinating scholar, rabbinic scholar, Ben Zoma. And it's in Tosefta Berakhot, chapter 6, and depending upon the numbering of anybody's edition, this is Tosefta number 5 within the chapter. And Ellie, do you want to read from your translation? And by the way, if someone purchases this book, the translation is found on pages 323 through 325.
Right. So this Tosefta quotes Ben Zoma on a couple of issues, but the common theme between them is Ben Zoma's really appreciation for the world and for the people. Ben Zoma was a really appreciative guy. He didn't take things for granted.
Wow.
And so there are two unrelated stories, and the story that's relative to Jewish drinking is really the second story, where he talks about drinking.
Although they're connected, it's still connected, right?
Well, they're connected. So the first story is about him saying how much he appreciates the fact that when he was born into this world, stuff was already there for him to use, and he didn't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch.
Yeah.
So he talked about how great it is that he can just go to a bakery and buy bread.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have to start from planting wheat and, working for 6 months before he can get a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
And the same thing is, he said, if I want to buy a wool coat, all I have to do is go to a store and buy a wool coat. I don't have to go, catch a wild sheep, then domesticate it, then make wool out of a sheep, spin it, and sew a coat together.
Yeah.
So that was his main appreciation in the first text. In the second text, his appreciation is actually for guests and hosts. Let's read the second text. So Ben Zoma used to say, "What does a good guest say? May the host be remembered for good. How many different types of wine he brought in front of us. How many different pieces of meat he brought in front of us. How many different types of fine white bread he brought in front of us. Everything that he did only for me. But what does a bad guest say? And what did I eat of his? I ate only one bread of his. I ate only one piece of meat of his. I drank only one cup of wine of his. Everything that he did only for his wife and for his children." And then it quotes a pasuk, a verse in Eov. It says, "Remember this, so that you may extol his work that people have witnessed." And to praise for God, that basically says that people have created all these different things in this world, but it's really when you look at them and you appreciate them, it's a big praise for God. But the interesting thing is, Ben Zoma obviously implied here that when he was hosted at different people's houses, they didn't just give him one cup of wine. They gave him many varieties of wine and probably got him drunk real good. Because if they would have just gotten him, one small drink, that's not something to get excited over.
Yeah. It's I have a lot of things to talk about this text. One thing that stands out is first of all, I'm just going to start with the really top, which is this is what Ben Zoma used to say, right? That this was it seems to be like it's a common saying out of his mouth, right? That he would go around and say, and look, people host people all the time or are hosted themselves, so he can note this social interaction, and it really, on the good guest side, you have, there are all these different types of wines versus the not good guest. I drink only one cup of wine, right? It's not clear whether this is the exact same experience for both the good and the bad guests.
Right.
Right. It almost seems as if this is precisely the exact same experience, right?
It could be, yeah. It's kind of like how do you really? I'm assuming he's not saying this to the host to his face. I'm assuming if he was to say this, he's probably telling other people how he was hosted by somebody.
Right.
This is how he would react to it.
Right. I think I like what you say. I think it most likely is how he relates to the other people about the hosting. But he could also be saying directly to the host's face, right?
He could, but I feel like that would be like super blunt. It's like, oh, I hated eating here. You only gave me one cup of wine.
Right. For sure. It's funny. I don't know if this is like an optimist versus pessimist. You know how in our culture we say the glass is half full or half empty? It seems like the exact same thing. It's like the exact same experience, Or it's like, yeah, we drank wine, but it was only one cup versus, we had a bunch of different cups of wine. It was a
That's
great
right.
experience.
But notice that he didn't just say, "Oh, the good guest says he gave me a lot of wine." He said many different varieties. So it
Right,
wasn't enough to get just a whole bunch of the same wine.
right,
He got multiple varieties of wine.
right. Kama mine yeno. Yeah, that's really great. I'm just going to go on a little tangent. He's only discussed 4 times in the Mishnah, really
Okay.
not discussed that much. And then he gets discussed a little bit more in the Tosefta, which is relevant to our conversation. And he's usually referenced as he's not really part of the regular rabbinic conversation. He's more of seen as back in the times when the temple existed. And you have this, I think Rabbi Yehoshua, who mentions, oh yeah, I remember seeing Ben Zoma, and he was doing this weird thing. We have it here also in the Tosefta Chagiga, chapter 2, Tosefta 2. So it starts off talking about the 4 that enter into the Pardes. You have Ben Azai, Acher, Rabbi Akiva, and of course Ben Zoma, the protagonist of our text, and 4 different. They each encounter something different for them. And Ben Zoma has this weird whatever thing that happens to him, right? That he tzitz v'nifka alav, that something weird happens to him. And later on in the exact same text, we see Rabbi Yehoshua. It says Maaseh Rabbi Yehoshua. So there is this incident. Rabbi Yehoshua came across came across Ben Zoma, and they were literally just right next to each other, or they came up against each other. And Rabbi Yehoshua says hi. Right? He just says hi.
Right.
And Ben Zoma doesn't respond to him, like he's in a different world. So he says to him, I was watching the creation, and the only difference, there's nothing between I was watching creation. There's nothing between the upper waters and the lower, even a handbreadth. So it's funny because then the text goes on and it talks a little bit more about what Ben Zoma says. Again, this is all Tosefta stuff, which is very relevant. But later on, the text ends by Rabbi Yehoshua telling his students Ben Zoma was already like halfway out the door. Like he didn't have many days left until he died, which is like really fascinating text of Ben. I remember seeing Ben Zoma back in the day, and he was already into some funky stuff, and then he was out. Which seems like I mean, it makes sense that it's still connected to that text about the Pardes, that he was like the postscript, if you will, to that text, that instant.
Yep.
But Rabbi Yehoshua, as well as his colleague Rabbi Eliezer, both were in the post-destruction time, the latter part of the 1st century. Right? So you get the sense that this was a lot of the Ben Zoma texts we see involve the temple. So maybe mid-1st century. We're not exactly clear, at least from these texts, when Ben Zoma dies, right? Whether it's still while the temple's standing or post-destruction.
The story of the Pardes tells us that both of them died. One of them committed suicide, and the other one just died.
We don't know that Ben Azai committed suicide. The language there is in the Tosefta is Heitzitz umet alav. That somehow he looked and just death came upon him.
Well, it's theorized that means that he committed suicide.
Oh, okay, it's possible.
By
the way, it's the exact
that's what I mean. All these texts, they're all like shrouded in mystery, right? They're not really clear.
Yeah.
But anyway, Ben Zoma talks about how he was sick and he couldn't recover from his sickness.
In Sota, in the 15th chapter of the Tosefta there, that once he died, the Darshanim, the people who were like really go into the text died. That was the end. Which I think is really fascinating because in also the Mishnah, but we see it in Tosefta as well, that Ben Zoma's drashot really characterize him. Like we even see this on Seder night. We see this drasha of his in Berakhot about Shema being said at nighttime.
Right.
which I think ultimately characterizes him as someone who's into this darshanut aspect of his activities, which in some ways I feel it has to also color this Tosefta that we have in front of us in Brachot, right? That he's really going in, inquiring what is happening for this guest.
I always kind of thought, like, what would Ben Zoma be like if you would meet him?
Mm-hmm.
And my imagination kind of always thought that both Ben Zoma and Ben Azai would be kind of these guys where they were disappointed with what they got. And I have a theory why, because Ben Zoma says in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, chapter 4, Mishnah 1, he says, who is a rich person? The one who's happy with his portion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so it's almost like, to me, you have to think about it. Why is he the one who says that? Because my theory is that he was, a lot of the things that came in his lot were disappointment. So he was trying to bring himself up as like, I'm happy with my portion, with what I got.
Do we know much else about his life, though?
About Ben Zoma?
Yeah. I mean, sure, we see some interesting incidents in both the Mishnah and the Tosefta, but a lot of them, it's other sages asking him about aspects or him being darshaning things, but we don't have a lot of biographical info, right?
So the whole corpus of the rabbinic literature never says that Ben Zoma did not get married. It never says that explicitly. But it is always implied, because it says that about Ben Azai, and that's a Gemara in Horus on 2b. Then we have the story about Ben Azai in Ksubas 63a, which tells us about Rabbi Akiva's daughter and his engagement to her. Mm-hmm. And because Ben Azai and Ben Zoma are always paired together, and because the Gemara says that they have never been promoted to the title Rabbi, they were always students.
Yeah.
So the assumption is always made by that is that, they were kind of similar. So they didn't get married, and that's kind of what limited them. Because that's by the way, a Tosefta in Sanhedrin chapter 7, number 3, that says it's a requirement for a member of the Sanhedrin to be married. I almost feel like they were these geniuses, whose life aspired to great things, but were kind of met by society with disappointment because they were what we would call nonconformists. They didn't follow the standard procedure, and that limited them in the society that they lived. And so they kind of had to come up with these ideas as, well, I didn't get what I wanted, but I'm happy anyway.
I'm fascinated because I don't know a lot about Ben Azai. Ben Zoma, I know a little bit more. I'm curious, is there a lot about Ben Azai in rabbinic literature?
There's not a lot. There's pretty much, these are mostly the sources that I've mentioned to you.
Okay.
There's another medrash. So there's a book called Malachi Elyon, the Exalted Angels by Rabbi Reuven Margolios.
Okay.
He was a famous rabbi in Israel in the second half of the 20th century. Anyway, that book collects, it's his collection, but he didn't actually write the text. It's a collection of midrashim from all over the place, that from really obscure sources. A lot of them are not existent in other places. And the common topic to them is everything about angels.
Huh, wow. Okay.
So in that book, there's a very long medrash about the story of the Pardes, because the story of the Pardes is in the Gemara. It's very, very short.
In Chagiga.
It just tells us, they entered the Pardes. They saw what's called Shtei Reshuyos, right? 2 gods, and all of them, kind of 3 of them lost it. Ben Azai went crazy. Ben Zoma got sick and died. Ben Azai went crazy and died. Acher stopped being religious and just left the whole community, and Rabbi Akiva was the only one that survived. My theory always was, why did Rabbi Akiva survive? Why didn't the others survive? I always viewed Rabbi Akiva as a character of what we would call a zealot. He was very hardcore. And it's interesting. I'll explain it to you. There was a study recently done in Israel on members of the organization called Zaka.
Yeah.
You know who Zaka is, right? They're the ones who go into terrorist bombings, and they scrape off all the body parts from the exploded body parts from all over the place and prepare them for burial. And all of them are very religious, members of the ultra-Orthodox community. But the study that was done of them was actually a medical study, is because the work that they do is very traumatic. The things that they see is kind of most people cannot deal with.
Yeah.
And what the study has found, it followed a bunch of them around and it interviewed them, and they found that for the most part, statistically, the members of Zaka are not affected by this. They do not get PTSD. They do not get post-traumatic stress disorder, whereas other people who are involved in the same situation very much get post-traumatic stress disorder and get very sick.
Yeah.
And so you can Google it. I don't remember the exact title of the article, but it's a medical article. You can find it on Google Scholar. But one of the things that they found is that because the members of Zaka are such great believers in God and they feel that they're doing God's work, PTSD does not affect them because they almost have a higher purpose and so your emotions don't take over.
Wow.
So I feel like Rabbi Akiva was that type of guy. All four of them went through a very traumatic experience. Mm-hmm. 3 of them got PTSD and reacted to it in their 3 different ways, whereas Rabbi Akiva did not. Yeah. And if you read the story of Rabbi Akiva about his execution, when the Romans were combing his flesh with iron combs, they were basically skinning him alive.
Yeah.
What's he doing while it says his students are looking at it and they're all freaking out. Yeah. Meanwhile, he's there. Don't worry, guys. I'm saying Shema. I'm happy to go. Not a big deal. Yeah. And that's a typical reaction of a person who does not get affected by PTSD.
Wow.
So, a little mix in there. But in any case, this medrash in this book, Malachei Elyon, talks in great detail. I think it's about 2 or 3 pages long about their story of how they entered the paradise and what they saw there. Yeah. And there's this whole spin about the angel Metatron, which is, one of these higher angels who supervises God's throne, how he was playing tricks on them. And it's very interesting because, to me, it's like I read about it, okay, the angel part, that's like a metaphor, right? It's not really meant to be taken seriously. But their reaction of how do they react to it, that's their real emotions that actually happen to them. And so one of the interesting things is it mostly focuses on Acher, but it has some comments about Ben Zoma and Ben Azai too, is how they were telling Acher, you got to review it again and again. In other words, Acher was like, no, what I see, I cannot unsee. That was basically his response. I'm far gone because what I saw is that's it. I'm done. And they kind of kept telling him, no, you have to be able to unsee it. You got to look at it another way. So anyway, so there are stories like that. But, for most part, they're not we don't have great detail about them.
Ellie, thank you so much. This is great discussing this Tosefta with about Ben Zoma and Brachot. And again, if people want to buy this book, this translation of Tosefta Berakhot, they can just find it on toseftaonline.org, correct?
Yep, yeah, that's right.
Awesome. And I'm going to put a link to that book here in the comments. And thank you so much, Ellie.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And l'chaim.
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 Thank you.
Absolutely.